Tonight's talk is entitled Events Around John the Baptist's Death. And as much as we're not absolutely sure when John the Baptist died, we can suggest that the timeline fits around about the point that we're up to now. And tonight's talk actually represents a sort of a major milestone in Jesus' ministry in several ways. For one thing, the 12 apostles would be sent out for the first time. Secondly, John the Baptist would be put to death, bringing an end to his mission, and in a sense, an end of an era from the Old Testament transitioning into the New Testament era, as it were. Thirdly, Jesus' own ministry will reach the peak of its popularity as far as we can tell from the record. Fourthly, Jesus will begin or commence the final year of his ministry before his crucifixion. Besides these things, this portion of the Gospel records is interesting in another respect because it seems to be where the Gospel of Matthew begins to come back into line with the other three Gospels and follows the same chronological order of events. I know that many commentators treat Matthew as if it is in chronological order right through, and that goes back to very ancient times. That view goes back to the apostolic or church fathers, but I really can't see that being true when you compare it with the other three Gospels, which all track in the same order, and trying to reconcile that with Matthew just creates confusion. Whereas if you accept that there are some chapters in Matthew that are out of chronological order, it makes the Gospel records correlate much easier. Ever since Matthew 4, chapter 4, verse 22, when Jesus had called the 4 fishermen away from their fishing boat that time, that was obviously the 2 sons of Zebedee as well as Peter and Andrew. From that time, Matthew's Gospel has presented the events which followed on for the next several chapters in quite a different order than Mark and Luke have done. Mark and Luke follow the same sequence, and they definitely seem to be arranged chronologically, which is why my own series through the Gospels follows their order of events. Matthew, from chapter 4, verse 23 through to 13, verse 58, is divided into 13 segments which describe the same events as Mark and Luke, but not in the same sequence. So obviously Matthew seems to me to have had a different priority, a different reasoning in the way that he's arranged his gospel, and that's why we've oscillated back and forth in Matthew's gospel during the series instead of following Matthew's written order of events. Now, regarding the question as to why Matthew's gospel is arranged as it is, I still don't really know the answer. Obviously, it was based on subject rather than timing. So there is a theme that Matthew is trying to establish. Some people suggest one thing, some people suggest another. For example, a major thesis is that Matthew was writing specifically to Jewish Christians and also to Jews who were not Christians. So in a sense, scholars reckon that Matthew's gospel was a preaching work to unbelieving Jews. But be that as it may, there could be other explanations as well. I would appreciate hearing anybody's suggestions or explanations. Another feature at this stage of Jesus' ministry is that besides Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they also end up linking with the Gospel of John at the point where the feeding of the 5,000 is recorded. But as much as that was read about this evening, I don't believe we will get that far this evening. We last considered John's Gospel way back a year earlier in Jesus' ministry, at John chapter 5 at the pool at Bethesda, and when Jesus had the confrontation with the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, presumably at the time of Passover. Before continuing any further, we could briefly review or summarize the ministry of Jesus so far, which is about 2.5 years long at this stage. I've attempted to assign the gospel events to a particular time of year, as you'll appreciate, sometimes just generally in terms of the season of the year, and sometimes more specifically assigning it to a month or a week or even a day. And obviously we can't be certain of the timing of every event, but we can be reasonably confident of the timing of many events. And the sense of the timing of an event can be a valuable tool for adding perspective or different dimensions to our mental picture of what we read in the Gospels. It can add detail as well, so we can imagine the weather, the temperature, the landscape and vegetation, and we can even imagine what people were doing from day to day at different times of the year, what sort of work they were doing, whether they were traveling to Jerusalem for feasts and that sort of thing. For the sake of simplicity, I've treated the Jewish New Year to be about from mid-March, and I've treated that as the beginning of spring. Passover is always 2 weeks after the Jewish New Year. So on this scheme, Jesus' baptism and his temptation in the wilderness and the wedding at Cana, which happened shortly after the temptation, all happened at late winter. And then in spring, Jesus began his public ministry, first in Jerusalem at Passover when he talked to Nicodemus, and then in Judea until he heard that John the Baptist had been arrested. I believe it was quite late in summer at this stage when Jesus left Judea and then went through Samaria, where he met the woman of Samaria at the well, and then he got back into Galilee and started ministering in Galilee. Autumn saw Jesus visit Nazareth at Luke chapter 4. Then he dwelt in Capernaum, where he ministered before touring around Galilee again. That winter, the first year of Jesus' ministry, Jesus went to a certain city at Luke chapter 5 verse 12, which was possibly Jerusalem during the Feast of Dedication. And then he went to a desert place at Mark 1 verse 45 before returning to Capernaum. Next spring was the time, or put it another way, next Passover was the time of the major crisis with the Jewish leaders. Firstly in Jerusalem, where he healed the man at the pool of Bethesda, and then in the wheat fields when his disciples were plucking wheat on the Sabbath, and then after that there was a crisis in the synagogue at Mark 3. And even though they seemed like small passages, they were actually milestones in Jesus' relationship with the Jewish leaders. From early summer, he withdrew to the lake again, partly for safekeeping, and there he was joined by huge crowds, some of whom had come from places like Lebanon and from east of the Jordan River, and this gave rise to Jesus' Sermon at the Mount. Autumn saw Jesus at Simon the Pharisee's house in Luke 7 verse 36, which was again probably in Jerusalem, and then he journeyed northward again throughout every city and village at Luke chapter 8 verse 1, which is where Luke specifically mentions the name of several women that were going with Jesus and the other disciples and were ministering to Jesus. The day that Jesus taught by parables and then calmed the storm on the lake and then healed the Gadarene demoniac was, I believe, late autumn or even early winter. And the most recent events surrounding the healing of Jairus' daughter, when the woman with the blood issue was also healed, they've taken place in probably about the last month of the year, near the end of winter. So we're now very near the end of Jesus' second full year of public ministry. And I'll just go back to that portion which came after the healing of Jairus' daughter. So obviously Jesus had instructed the people there that witnessed the healing of Jairus' daughter to not publicize her resurrection from the dead. She was certainly dead, this young girl, but Jesus raised her from the dead, and that I believe is the second of Jesus' resurrection miracles after the healing of the young man in the city of Nain. As we saw in Mark chapter 5 verse 43, he gave the people, that is the householders, the mother and the father, as well as his three apostles with him, do not publicize this resurrection miracle. However, Jesus' command seems to have not been heeded, because as we read in Matthew 9, from verse 26 through verse 33, it says, Matthew says that after the girl arose, this news went out into all the land. So obviously, even though Jesus had tried to restrain people from publicizing the miracle, they couldn't be stopped. And so they were spreading the news around, and it went into all that land. And as Jesus passed on from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying out and saying, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." They obviously realized that Jesus' ability to even heal the dead was sufficient reason to believe that he would heal their blindness. Verse 28, after he had come into the house, presumably the house where he dwelt in Capernaum or Bethsaida, possibly, the blind men came up to him, and Jesus said to them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" And they said to him, "Yes, Lord." Then he touched their eyes, saying, "Be it done to you according to your faith." And their eyes were opened. And Jesus again sternly warned them, saying, "See here, listen, let no one know about this." But they went out and spread the news about him in all that land. And as they were going out, behold, a dumb man who was demon-possessed was brought to Jesus. And after the demon was cast out, the dumb man spoke, and the multitudes marveled, saying, "Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel." So only a few verses earlier, Jesus had forbidden the proclaiming, the spreading abroad of the news of the young girl's resurrection from the dead. And just after another few verses, in verse 33, we discover that all the multitudes around Capernaum and the northern Lake District all know about this, saying nothing like this was ever seen in Israel. So it seems, a plain reading suggests that within just a matter of hours, Jesus' miracles of raising the dead and healing the blind and the dumb were widely reported around Capernaum, and this was in spite of Jesus' instructions. But Jesus had performed these miracles in Galilee before now, so why was secrecy and confidentiality so imperative just at this time? Why do Matthew, Mark, and Luke all refer to it at this stage of his ministry? And I believe that there is one reason which Jesus could not explain to the people at this time, but which would become increasingly pressing as the months pass in the following year. The context here in Matthew 9 suggests that these last 3 healings were performed for Israelites who were not among the multitudes themselves, but were numbered more specifically among the community leaders or synagogue leaders. So not only was Jairus a ruler of the synagogue, but I believe too that the 2 blind men who had presumably been blind for many more years than this, had not been healed until now. I believe that they were also religious leaders in Capernaum. And then the man that was dumb, I believe he was also one of the community leaders. So the reason that Jesus could not explain it to the people was that, as I say, the context suggests that they were among the community leaders or synagogue rulers whom Jesus has just healed. So here was another especially dangerous and threatening development as far as the religious leadership would be concerned. Jesus had been popular among the multitudes for a year now, but now he was breaking through. His ministry was touching and being received by actual Jewish religious leaders. And there was a growing popularity, possibly within the synagogue fraternity. And this would be a provocation to the high up echelons of the scribes and Pharisees and, of course, the other religious leaders. So not only would Jesus be a target for their hostility, but so also would be those religious leaders, those synagogue rulers and people like them, rabbis in their own right, community leaders who were also showing allegiance to Jesus. Now, I suggested last time I spoke that the latest healings which Jesus performed at Matthew 9 represented a new wave of faith and interest in Jesus. And for about 9 months now, there had been no positive contact between Jesus and the Jewish eldership. Jesus' contact had been with the multitudes only. So as I say, this is quite a major milestone that we're reading about here in Matthew 9. After the last confrontation in the synagogue back in Mark chapter 3 verse 1, the Pharisees had set out to destroy Jesus' ministry. They had the authority and influence to forbid the synagogues from receiving and patronizing Jesus, and they had come up with the view that Jesus was in league with Beelzebub or Satan, so as to contradict and quash the growing speculation that Jesus is the son of David, the Messiah, in other words. However, in spite of the official rejection of Jesus, which was obviously springing out of Jerusalem primarily, there were obviously now many Jewish elders who were privately becoming convinced of the truth and the goodness of Jesus and his ministry. So a tension was developing under the surface within the Jewish eldership itself, between faith in Christ on one hand and the official Jewish party line. And of course, the staunch Jewish leaders would turn their hostility on any elders who followed Jesus because they would see them as a threat to the whole Jewish leadership. When people heard that Jairus, the synagogue ruler, had approached Jesus, then other Jewish elders and community leaders found the courage to do the same. And Matthew describes the 2 blind men and the dumb man with them who confessed Jesus as son of David. Then this marked a crisis point, as it were. We know that these 3 were together because it was the 2 blind men who brought the dumb man to Jesus when he healed them, according to the timeline, unless they had come with a bit of a mixed group. We know that Jesus received them and healed them privately because, as we pointed out, he commanded them not to inform anybody. And we can infer that these 3 were men of some prominence because the multitudes all recognized them to identify that they had been genuinely healed, and yet had said that we haven't seen such a thing before. And that's why I suggest that they were actually from among the leadership. Now, in disobedience to Jesus' command, these men publicized the healings throughout the region, just as Jairus had evidently done earlier, and this immediately posed a threat of retaliation by the hostile religious leaders. But Matthew 9 verse 34 says that the worst they could do was restate their accusation. He casts out the demons by the ruler of the demons. So they're going to try to keep using this as their way of disarming the argument that Jesus was working by the power of God. It was actually a weak, illogical argument which Jesus had already refuted at least once, but the Pharisees continued to use it almost to the end of Jesus' ministry, so it must have had something of the desired effect of undermining some people's faith in Jesus. Nevertheless, the reports of Jairus' daughter and of the blind and dumb men quickly gave rise to large numbers of the Jewish eldership defying the official ban and opening the synagogues to Jesus. We read at chapter 9, Matthew 9, verse 35, "And Jesus was going about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every kind of disease and sickness." And now suddenly, this other large segment of Jewish society in Galilee was able to approach and receive Jesus with the sanction or the compliance of those synagogue leaders. The ministry which the multitudes and the publicans and the sinners had been coming under for the last 9 months at least, now the more conservative religious Jews were also enjoying. This meant another increase in the numbers of Jesus' followers, plus more agitation and resentment, as I suggested, among the Jewish leadership. Matthew 9:35 is only one verse to describe Jesus' circuit of the synagogues, which was probably a fairly intense campaign. But Mark chapter 6 verse 1 and Matthew 13 verse 54 seem to connect at this point to refer to this same circuit of the synagogues at the time that Jesus ended up back at Nazareth. We'd seen in Luke chapter 4 that Jesus visited Nazareth, and he caused a stir there, and many of the people tried to throw him down the cliff face or the hillside to put him to death, but he escaped from their hands. So here was another time that he arrives at Nazareth, and this would be another example of the chronological discontinuity or dislocation of passages in Matthew's Gospel. We'll have a look at what Mark chapter 6 says from verses 1 to 6. So he went out from there, and he came into his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath had come, he began to teach in the synagogues, and many listeners were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things, and what is this wisdom given to him, and such miracles as these performed by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. So this is in his hometown, where evidently Jesus' sisters continued to live with their husbands. Jesus said to the people of Nazareth in the synagogue, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his own relatives and in his own household." But Mark goes on to say that he could do no miracle there except that he laid his hands upon a few sick people and healed them. and Jesus wondered at all the people's unbelief. Many Bible students treat this as the same visit to Nazareth as in Luke chapter 4, but the order and chronological setting of the two visits are quite different from each other, and they're about 18 months apart. I don't think there's any way that we can argue against that chronological difference. In Luke's record of Jesus' earlier visit to Nazareth, we saw that the prejudice against Jesus was so strong that the congregation tried to kill him, but he escaped from them. And now, after a year and a half of highly publicized ministry, Jesus would have wished and maybe expected a much more positive and receptive attitude from the congregation in Nazareth. Nevertheless, the congregation were still virtually as negative as they had been earlier, although obviously there were some there that he was able to heal because they had faith in him. But for the most part, they did not set out to harm Jesus physically this time, probably because they could see that he had many disciples and supporters with them. But they did set out to harm Jesus' reputation. They were saying things like that he was merely one of their own. He was a Nazarite, or a Nazarene, I should say. He was merely a Nazarene, and, no great thing can come out of Nazareth. Also, he was simply a carpenter or a tradesman. He wasn't one of the official scholars. He wasn't one of the official writers and scholars of the Scriptures. So how could he possibly be a man of God of the same ilk as the rabbis and the scribes and the Pharisees? They were also saying, we know he is Mary's son. They didn't say that he was Joseph's son, but they were implying that he was Mary's illegitimate son. They were not even sure, so to say, who his father was. They knew his mother and his brothers, who had all said just a short time ago, a few months ago, that he was crazy or hysterical. And so if his own family members think that Jesus has lost his mind or is crazy or hysterical, then who are we to doubt them? Some of the congregation were his brothers-in-law, and of course, as I say, his sisters. So in their mind, Jesus was no more special than the natural family. It was Jesus' appearance of absolute authority and integrity that the Nazarenes must have thought was most pretentious and perhaps most offensive. Jesus had marveled that these people were so indignant and so prejudiced that they could actually resist and quench the power of the Holy Spirit in his ministry. By rejecting Jesus so stubbornly, they could not be receptive to anything in the way of the power of God which he had to offer. Jesus would probably not return to Nazareth again after this, and as far as I know, there's no New Testament record of Jesus going back to Nazareth in his final year of ministry, although I concede that he might have gone there after his resurrection. It was at about this time that the tragic death of John the Baptist probably occurred. Matthew and Mark both record this event retrospectively. In other words, they don't describe it in its correct chronological order. They describe it from a sort of a historical perspective. They describe it from the perspective of a later date when Herod is actually remembering the event of killing John. We can read about it now because it was probably around about this time that the death of John took place. So Mark chapter 6 verses 21 through 23 says that a strategic day came about when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his lords and military commanders and for the leading men of Galilee. So presumably this took place in Herod's capital city, which was on the coast of the Sea of Galilee. That was the city called Tiberias, whereas John the Baptist was in prison, most likely at Machaerus, which was on the cliffs above the Dead Sea, so quite a long way away from where this banquet was taking place. Verse 22 of Mark 6 says that when the daughter of Herodias herself came in and danced for Herod and his guests, she pleased Herod and pleased his dinner guests, and the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you want, and I will give it to you." And he swore an oath to her, "Whatever you ask of me, I will give it to you, up to half of my kingdom." Herod's banquet is said to have been on a convenient or a strategic day, and those words mean well-timed or opportune. This opportune or strategic day was, I believe, prepared by Herod's wife, Herodias, who had wanted John the Baptist dead for a long time. Now, I'm not sure where the banquet was held. If it was at the castle of Machaerus, which is where John was imprisoned, then John's death happened the day of the birthday. But if the banquet was held at Tiberias in Galilee, which I think was much more likely, then that was 120 kilometres away from where John was imprisoned, in which case the following events happened over about 4 or 5 days, to take into account the need to travel. Herodias' daughter was called Salome. She was a Middle East version of a popular, dancer, such as you might see at the Super Bowl. I don't know the style of all the dancing, but we know that from the archaeology of Egypt and of Greece and of Rome in particular, dancing could be very dynamic, very gymnastic, and it could be rather lewd. So the dance was obviously physically attractive and skillful, and I imagine it was somewhat erotic and seductive. And obviously Hollywood has had quite some fun depicting Salome's dance. And in fact, it's even featured in operas and that sort of thing. Herod was infatuated by her performance, obviously, and I imagine he was rather drunk by that time, drunk enough to make his promise to her without thinking it through, and probably doing it rather impulsively. So we read from verses 24 through 25, Salome, she went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask for?" And her mother said, "The head of John the Baptist." And immediately Salome came in haste before the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me right away the head of John the Baptist on a platter." We get the impression from this that Salome was truly her mother's daughter. Not only did she immediately resort to her mother for her opinion and advice on Herod's offer or Herod's promise, but Salome also readily agreed to her mother's murderous demand. I think Salome, if she had been a bit more independently minded, she would have decided that was a waste of a good promise, and she could have asked for something that she really wanted. But obviously she was of like mind with her mother, or more likely under her mother's thumb. It does imply that Salome was okay about seeing John the Baptist dead, and obviously she didn't begrudge that request. We can reasonably infer that this whole scenario had been planned by Herodias, possibly by prior arrangement with Salome. This record gives the impression of two ambitious and unscrupulous women, but also the impression of a very impetuous, a very impulsive and pliable Herod. Herod seemed to have been manipulated and led along after making his first promise to Salome. A promise by itself was serious enough, but the fact that he managed to swear an oath to keep his word to Salome just goes to show how caught up he was in Salome's dance. Now we know that Herod was not minded to kill John, because we read in the previous verses that even though Herodias hated John for saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife," and verse 19 says that Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death, but she couldn't do so. It says that Herod was afraid of John. He had a fear and, I imagine, an awe of John that was based not only on the fact that John was a very strident and very authoritative sounding person, but that Herod believed that he was of God. It says that he was afraid of God, afraid of John, knowing that he was a righteous man and a holy man. Now, sometimes we can fear someone because, they can rebuff us or they can stand up to us, and sometimes it's because they can make us realize our true standing. They can make us realize that maybe something that we did or something about our personality is not a good thing. And so if we're honest with ourselves, we can respect that from the other person. And that evidently is what Herod did. He respected what John had to say to him and regarded him as a righteous man. But of course he also regarded him as a holy man, which meant that he believed he was a man sent of God. And therefore Herod kept him safe, as Mark 6 verse 20 says. So he kept him away from Herodias' influence. But now Herodias has put Herod in a position where he could not save face except he put John to death. So we read from verses 26 through 27 that although the king was very sorry, yet because of his oaths and because of his dinner guests, he was unwilling to refuse her. This suggests not only his embarrassment in the company of his dinner guests, but also suggests that the dinner guests were agreeable to John the Baptist being put to death. I believe that Herod would have encountered scorn and resistance from them if he had tried to keep John safe. Immediately, the king sent an executioner and commanded the executioner to bring back John's head. And so the executioner went and had him beheaded in the prison. Herodias had wanted to kill John for over a year now, but Herod had kept him safe in prison because, as I say, he had a certain fear and respect for him. For John, though, who had grown up in the wide open expanse of the wilderness in southern Judea, the gloomy confinement of the prison was actually a very severe trial. And as we considered earlier this evening, he'd been in prison for quite some time, right near the beginning of Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem. So almost 2 years now, John the Baptist had been in prison. And for him, it would have been a very constraining place that could have caused him considerable anguish. We know that people like the Australian Aborigines and the Kalahari Bushmen, who are used to living in the wild, whenever the colonists or the white people had an issue with one of them and put them in a jail for some reason, that was sometimes enough for them to die within a day or two because they just couldn't handle being in confinement. John was used to being active and busy in the service of God. In prison, all he could do was passively wait on God and commune with God in prayer and in recalling the words of God, the scriptures. During this time, he had been haunted, I believe, by doubts about Jesus' real identity, and he must have wondered if his own mission had been somehow misguided. We know that because John had sent a message to Jesus asking, are you really the coming one? Are you really the one that is to come, who we've been waiting for all this time? And Jesus had to counsel John, sending the messengers back with the details of some of the many miracles that Jesus had performed. But Jesus also said, blessed is he who is not offended at me. So it was a way of exhorting John to keep believing in him and to not stumble. Anyway, in the prison, in all these different ways, as boredom and loneliness and frustration and despair had tempted to drag him down, God was perfecting John. Obviously, there were elements of John that God needed him to be free and able to perform his ministry. There were aspects of John that needed to be set apart so that John could be improved, as it were, so that the rough edges might be taken off John possibly, and that John could learn to be at peace in God, even in a situation that was not to his liking and that was so different to what he had been used to all his life. So John's character was being strengthened and improved by having his faith extended, having his faith challenged, his faith in Jesus, that is, having his patience stretched, and of course his long-suffering, and especially his trust in God that all things would work together for good. Fortunately for John, his knowledge and recall of God's word must have continually ministered to him. I imagine that John was one of those people that had such a good knowledge of the word that even if he was deprived of the written scriptures, he could recite the books of Moses and all the chronicles and the scriptures and the Psalms and the Proverbs. He could be reciting them to himself from day to day as he was stuck in that jail. We know that Herod had allowed John's disciples to visit as well. So he had some times of fellowship and some times of exchange with people of like precious faith. I'm confident that John regarded the coming of the executioner as a welcome relief once he knew what was about to happen. His beheading with one blow of a sharp saber or axe would be instantaneous and presumably painless for the most part. But if it was with a knife and he might have been stabbed or had his throat cut, then of course it would be much more harrowing. John knew, though, that the very next thing he would know will be his resurrection to a beautiful, glorious, everlasting life. And of course he would be in the presence of all those people that he had known and loved, both in his earthly life and in the scriptures. John, of course, John the Baptist, is now at peace. He's asleep in death. But for years after his death, Herod must have been terribly cursed by regret and self-reproach for causing John's death. We read at Mark 6, verse 28. So John's head was brought in on a platter and it was given to the girl. The girl gave it to her mother. To me, that's another interesting insight into Salome that she would be willing to actually behold this man's bloody head on a platter and to be able to go and give it to her mother. She must have been quite a character. So neither Salome nor her mother Herodias had any qualms about viewing John's severed head. They both evidently wanted to see it. So I suggest that these were two malicious and sadistic women who were not content simply to condemn John. They wanted to mock or deride him as well. Nevertheless, we do know from the secular historical record of Salome's later life. She ended up marrying one of the Herods that we don't know very much about, because he was a very mild character. He wasn't getting into wars and conflicts and things, but he ended up marrying Salome. So she ended up living what seems to have been a particularly peaceful life. Nothing terrible or tragic happened to that son of Herod. So maybe Salome was given the opportunity to repent of what she had done, and presumably living so close to the action where Jesus' ministry had taken place, and obviously living during a time when the gospel of Jesus' resurrection was spreading around the land, it is possible that Salome came to an understanding of the gospel. And who knows, maybe it was God's way of putting her in a position where she could consider her ways and maybe even repent. Now, there were likely to have been at least one or two disciples staying near the prison for John's sake at any one time. Obviously, the fortress of Machaerus, where John was, is in a very desert region. It's not very hospitable, and one of the reasons that Herod was able to use it was because it was well appointed. It was like a Hilton hotel in the middle of the Arizona desert or something like that. So it was well appointed, but there may have been other dwellings right next to it where some of the disciples may have dwelt. In which case, the news of John's death might have come to them in less than a day, maybe just within a few hours. Not long ago, at Matthew chapter 9, verse 14, Jesus seemed to forewarn John's disciples that the day would come when their custom of fasting would eventually be in the context of mourning or grieving for the loss of their leader. He says, then they would fast. And this time had finally come. And their only consolation would have been that they were allowed to give John a respectful burial. John's death also forced his disciples to consider their own futures. Should they abandon John's mission? Should they continue to remain staunch disciples of John, even without his personal leadership? Or should they rally around another leader? And if so, who would that leader be? We know from the book of Acts that there were still disciples of John many, many decades after his death. And I'm given to understand that even in the 2nd century AD, there were still communities of Jews who were adherents of the memory of John the Baptist. But anyway, at this stage, near the end of Jesus' second year of ministry, for some of John's disciples, John's death was the final motivation that compelled them to do as John had said 2 years ago. That man is the Lamb of God who will take away the sin of the world. Follow him. He had been saying that to crowds of people shortly after Jesus had been baptized and shortly after Jesus came back from his temptation in the wilderness. So 2 years ago, John had been trying to tell his disciples to go after Jesus instead of continuing to follow him. But now, for multitudes of John's disciples, his death was the final motivation that compelled them to turn to Jesus, just as John had instructed them to do all those months and years ago. So Matthew 14 verse 12 says, "And John's disciples came and took away the body of John and buried it, and they went and reported it to Jesus." And I'll close at that point, and God willing, we'll come back to the events that pan out after that event.